Hello again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 143. And this episode, we wanted to talk about the beginnings, the starts, the first releases. There's a lot of long-running franchises and series in video games, and it's always very interesting to take a moment and look back at the first releases, see what they got right, got wrong, per se, or certainly what was established and what was quickly discarded in the time it took to make further releases and sort of establish the series quo.
Yeah, initial releases are a funny thing, right? Because I think in the early days of video games, no one had a franchise thought, right? People just released games. And I think it's not until more current gen stuff that I feel like people plan for longer runs of series, depending on the company, the backing, if it's an in-house studio, if it's an indie publisher, whatever else. And I think it's very easy to go back to the original Super Mario Brothers and think this is an initial title. This is the title that launched this franchise. But the reality is it isn't. The title that launched that franchise was Mario Brothers, the arcade game. Mm-hmm. It was born out of that. Super Mario Brothers is the first Super Mario Brothers game, but the first Mario game technically is Donkey Kong.
I was about to say like Mario Brothers, but actually Donkey Kong. But actually, no, it's Donkey Kong.
But, like, of course, he was Jumpman then, and, like, there's been theories that that's actually Mario's dad, and Mario and Luigi are the children of Jumpman. It's, like, none of which is in the text of the game. But I just think it's funny because, for sure, when you're creating arcade games like Nintendo was back then, they weren't thinking of these console releases, these less arcadey experiences, more narratively driven experiences, though the narrative was go to castle, beat bad guy, go to next castle. But still, like, there was a story in the instruction manual and everything.
Yeah, exactly. Video games are not unique in there being releases and works that seem as though they were the first in a larger franchise or a larger overarching story that never got released. You know, the movie needs to make enough money. The book needs to sell enough. They need to get renewed for the second season. And from there, the idea of, well, this should be a standalone thing. And then after that going, oh, but it's actually part of something a bit bigger. That's been going on for as long as there's been capitalism and stories altogether.
For sure. And something like Mario is something that, because with Super Mario Brothers specifically, you look at that initial title, which I think anyone is familiar with, and then you think about the sequel in the States, which was not actually the sequel in Japan. And I think that's what's interesting about this initial title that spawned two vastly different sequels. One that was a dream, that was a reskin of an existing other Japanese game. And then the other one was just more, but harder, which was often at the time the Japanese style of making games is like, here's this arcade experience. Let's make the same thing, but harder, or the same thing from a different perspective. You think about Donkey Kong Jr. and all that stuff. And I think it's really interesting when we're looking at franchises that, for sure, like you're saying back then, like people like to praise the MCU, and I'm hit or miss on it lately. I do love seeing the movies, but like everyone's like, oh, they were planning it from the start. Thanos was always the big bad. No, they weren't. They put Thanos as a thing at the end of the first Avengers movie to be like, hey, we'll go here eventually. Mm-hmm. But then they started to plan it out as things started to build up. They built the faces, whatever. And I think that's true of most video game franchises. I would say that most initial titles in a franchise show us that they don't actually know where the series is going. I mean, the most famous story that we've told on this podcast multiple times, Final Fantasy was called Final Fantasy because the studio thought it was their last game. It was their last attempt.
Sakaguchi did. Sakaguchi was like, this is my last big one.
Right. And he's like, if this doesn't sell, if this doesn't do well, we're done. It's our Final Fantasy. And then it ended up becoming one of the biggest RPGs released and spawned many sequels. We're going to get 16 this year. And so, like,
very excited.
Same. But I think it's really interesting that initial title was so far the opposite of franchise planning. They assumed it was their last one. They thought it was going to be one and done, and then Sakaguchi will move on to whatever he's going to do next. And instead, it became his bread and butter for quite some time.
Also remember that when Final Fantasy was released, the notion of a console RPG, a role-playing game of that pen and paper ilk.
Yeah.
The PC market had a fairly robust RPG back catalog. If you wanted to play Wizardry or if you wanted to play any of the others that I'm blanking on at the moment, that was there. And those were the source of inspiration for Final Fantasy, or the only other one at the time, Dragon Quest.
Right.
Which again, and there might have been a few others that I'm blanking on, but it pretty much was one of those ideas of within a year or so, the concept of an RPG on a home console with a controller sort of blossomed. It spontaneously generated, however you want to think of it. It alchemized. So, yeah, the notion of people are going to like this or people are going to want more of this is a little wild. And
Yeah.
I'm really glad we got wild.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about initial titles, though, that I think is also worth marking is like they are often a classic and like the key to the kingdom, the thing that launched 1,000 ships, but they are rarely the best in the series, especially if we're talking the Nintendo era. Maybe now, but even still, I think I could say boldly that often the second, third, fourth games iterate to a better place. Like, for example, the original Metroid, which like I'm grateful for and is an incredible piece of design on the Nintendo, is also for me, and I would think for many, by far one of the worst games because it's just so difficult. There's no way to navigate it. Like, especially looking at stuff like Dread and Prime and Fusion, the heaviest of hitters within the franchise. But we would also not have any of that if it weren't for that initial title. I think of the original Zelda also, which saying the worst is hard, especially since in that case, the sequel, a lot of people hated because it was so different.
Mm-hmm.
But I think both of the Nintendo entries are unique and important. But I still think that, like, again, the Link to the Past and what came shortly after Link to the Past set the groundwork for the future of that franchise. And arguably, the reason I think everyone thinks games like Ocarina of Time, Metroid Prime, Super Mario 64 are the best in those franchises is because they were almost like relaunches of those franchises, because it was the first time any of them went into 3D. And so it was an initial title within the 3D landscape, even though it was much later on in the franchise's history.
This is an interesting, way late companion piece to our episode ages ago about the second entry in franchises, which is kind of a funny thing. This is our prequel.
Yes.
But I love that you mentioned Metroid and Zelda, because those are examples I think of when I think of this because of people going back to the original because they played a later one.
Yeah.
I remember playing the original Metroid when that was the only Metroid I had access to in my cousin's bedroom on his NES, because they were the ones that had the copy of Metroid, and loving the game. Not necessarily to obsession, but really enjoying the game. And then, yes, of course, going and playing Super Metroid and going, oh my God, a map? Thank you. This is incredible.
Yeah.
But Metroid was built on limitations. One of those things where later mapper chips on the NES allowed for diagonal scrolling or simultaneous horizontal and vertical scrolling. But the reason that the rooms were set up the way they were on NES Metroid were because some rooms could horizontal scroll, some can vertical scroll. That's it. And so they had to set them up like that. Limited tile sets, things like that. You're making a lot with a little. And it was one of those earlier titles. And it was adapting a disk system game, which is why we got the password system, where in Japan on the Famicom disk system, you could save. All of these little concessions and things to make a good experience, which later games iterated on. And you went, I can't go back.
Yeah.
I just can't. I loved playing the original Final Fantasy. I loved playing it as a kid. A few years ago, I finally sat down and played the NES version all the way through. I'm glad I did. But you're right. It's not what I'd recommend to somebody. The original Legend of Zelda, in my notes, I have Zelda listed, and all I say is, Zelda. No one tells you shit.
Yeah, correct.
Because you go, Link to the Past, fantastic adventure, wonderful, evocative, magical. And everyone is being like, and oh, these things are happening, and welcome to this village, and oh, Ganon's doing this. It's a secret to everybody. It's dangerous to go alone. Take this. Dodongo dislikes smoke. I think I've now said half the script to the original Zelda, and that's part of its charm for those that are charmed by that, where you can go at it in any order, in any way. Yes, much like later Zelda titles, you are held back by the items you do or do not have, but no one's holding your hand. No one's telling you anything. You know, you go into an area where there's just an old lady in the cave. She's not going to tell you anything. You can't go up to her and be like, I don't trust you. But you got to show her a note so she trusts you and sells you medicine. But that's just the way those games are.
Yeah.
And whether or not that makes it better or worse is in the eye of the beholder or the hand of the controller. And yeah, I think That definitely happens where the first game occurs. They love the characters, they love the gameplay, they love the story, and then sequels clean it up. I
Yeah,
am thinking at a later generation of Crash Bandicoot.
sure.
I love Crash Bandicoot series, certainly the PS1 titles. So the Insane Trilogy and Crash 4 are wonderful for me. And the original Crash Bandicoot is the hardest to go back to. Not because you don't have the slide or the belly flop move. Really, it's because of the gems. All of the Crash Bandicoot games, there's a gem to collect in every level. There might be more, but there's always at least one that you get for breaking every box in the stage. In the original Crash Bandicoot, you got those gems by breaking every box and not dying in the stage.
Yes.
You had to get it in one life.
Yep.
It had been a while when I went back and then remembered that, and I got viscerally angry.
Yeah.
So I played that on the Insane Trilogy and just leave it be.
Yeah. I mean, that's the best way to revisit that. It's funny, like talking about all those Nintendo titles, I think something I didn't realize until we were talking about it is initial titles on the NES. Then when moving on to the sequel, they all changed drastically. You think about
Yes.
Zelda going to Zelda 2, you think about Castlevania going to Castlevania 2, but even more importantly, like you think about Metroid, the sequel wasn't even on the same console. It was on the Game Boy.
Mhm.
Think about the initial title from the Kirby series, it's flipped. The very first Kirby game was on the Game Boy, and then its sort of sequel was on the NES.
And Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy sort of set the standard for what the game wanted to be in terms of accessibility. But Kirby's Adventure codified so many things. You couldn't copy powers in Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy. Hell, Kirby was white on the cover, and the game was black and white. So Kirby was first pink in Kirby's Adventure. That level of change.
Yeah. But I think that, like you're talking about later generations, as gaming grew and as folks knew, like if they were a first party developer for a major company, your Microsoft, your PlayStation, your Nintendo, you might know from the get-go that you're going to get sequels. I mean, most famously, BioWare, when they were developing stuff exclusively for the Xbox initially, when Mass Effect was created, there was this understanding with Microsoft. And there are details to the story that I don't have 100%, but as far as I know, there was always going to be multiple games. The pitch on Mass Effect was always, you're going to make choices, those choices will matter, and in the subsequent games, it will affect them.
Okay, I did want to ask you about this, because I knew you'd know way more than me.
And this was always the plan for both Mass Effect and Dragon Age. To what extent, I don't think was clear in the beginning, but they definitely knew that the choices would matter and that they would carry over. And so for Mass Effect 1, it was, I think, barely ever just an initial game because there was always a plan for more games. The structure they would take, what would happen to Shepard, the major plot points they may have had figured out, but the smaller stuff for sure not. And it's just fascinating to me now looking on the other side of it. And like often on my best of lists, I include the Legendary Edition as one game. And people are like, that's 3 games. I'm like, it is, but it isn't. The reason that I am not upset by the ending of the 3rd game like so many people are is because it's one giant game. Like for me, I can't really play the first game and be like, I don't want to play the other 2. It's not how my brain works. Like I have to see that character through to the end.
Yeah.
That's why I often consider Andromeda an initial title, because even though it is the 4th Mass Effect game, and I won't take that away from it, it does sometimes feel like a brand new start. But there's something about developing games now that I think is a little different. I think about Dragon Age and how Dragon Age 1, Dragon Age Origins, is this point and click kind of turn-based RPG, and then the sequel is an action RPG, and the 3rd one is some mix of both. And like they are all very different from each other and across multiple generations. And what I'm curious about with game developers is when you're creating an initial title, do you ever think about, well, what if we get a sequel? What if we get another one? Especially now, like we are doing this episode shortly after the release of Octopath Traveler 2. Loved the first game, warts and all. It was not perfect, but I hear that the sequel has improved a lot of things. The story's more intertwined. The combat system is more nuanced, all of that stuff. I didn't know until it was announced in that direct that we were getting a sequel to this game. And I loved the first one. And so I was very excited. But like, how long did Square know that they were going to do another one? Also, when you're someone like Square Enix, you kind of have the freedom to do whatever you want to some degree, right? Not everything sells well. As much as I love the Guardians of the Galaxy game, it did not do as well as they would like. They published that one. But like, you think about Final Fantasy, like it's just kind of just assumed there's going to be another Final Fantasy game, single player, and there's going to be another 14 expansion at some point.
At this point, too big to fail almost.
Right. The ball is rolling. But when they released that initial title on the NES, they didn't know any of that. You know, they jumped titles in the US to make sure that we were getting the most advanced technology game as possible. And so that's how we get our 2 is 4 and 3 is 6. And so I'm curious now, it does seem like there's a franchise mindset to a lot of games. And I feel like that can also hurt a lot of games too, right?
Agreed.
If you're planning so far into the future, you're not necessarily looking at what's in front of you. I ended up really enjoying the first Dying Light. By the time I played the sequel, they made so many changes to it. It felt very Zelda 2. It was like, okay, so now I take degrading damage if I'm not under these UV lamps. I can't use the melee weapons the same way I did before. Like, it wasn't the same. And like, I think one of the failings of some initial titles is if, like, things can change from the first game to the sequel and so on. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think if you're laying groundwork in a certain kind of game, you have to clearly roadmap what the next one's going to be like, especially in the age of trailers and previews. I don't think a first game and a second game have to be identical. I do think you owe it to your audience, though, to be clear about what the changes are, at least mechanically, because the mechanics are like the thing that gets you going, gets you through it, right?
Right. And I think you're right. The idea of who gets to plan for the sequel while planning the first one.
Right.
And I think given my and yours, Matt, our predilection for indie games, there's probably far fewer studios that are able to plan for the sequel unless they do something like they kickstart enough that they're able to make the bonus campaign. Yeah. And that's not necessarily making the sequel, but that does give them the wherewithal and the time to polish the formula. Because sometimes you just need to make a good experience and know that if it works, you can polish the formula later.
Yeah.
I think of something like Assassin's Creed, a series that I admittedly do not have tons and tons of controller in hand experience. I've seen plenty of it. I've watched Sarah play a ton of it, and I've been around for all of it. And it's easy to remember. It's like, oh yeah, you remember playing Assassin's Creed? Oh my God, yeah, I love being Ezio. Assassin's Creed, man. That's Assassin's Creed 2. And they made 3 Assassin's Creed 2s. There's a whole Ezio collection. Altair exists. Altair's wonderful. Great game. You can't swim. There's a lot of other that's always the easy one to look at and be like, you can't swim. Yeah. And they had such a great baked in reason for why the gameplay is improved in the second one. We've improved the animus.
Yeah.
But I remember like when I had an Xbox 360 and someone gave me all of their old Assassin's Creed games. I'm like, great. I know everyone loves Ezio. I'm going to start with the first one. And you know what? Around the time that disc crapped out on me, I was about ready to crap out on the game. Good game. Loved it. I remember the reviews on it and the idea of, I think it was Microholic from Penny Arcade saying, this is the closest I've ever come to a real-life Batman game. Because this was before Arkham Asylum.
Right.
And that holds true. But also, they were a big enough studio. It's Ubisoft. You're able to iterate and polish on that. And being able to trust that you have a good standalone experience before deciding to franchise it or make more of it. People want more of it. And I think we're still on the same idea of the Mario 2. Do you just want it to be a kind of arcadish idea of this but more? Or do you want us to go off somewhere else because you just like the characters, but you want a new experience?
Yeah, I don't think there's a right answer to whether you can iterate or not. I think it's just understanding it. I mean, in the Nintendo era, like we had magazines and there were some newspaper articles and other things, but for the most part, we didn't have trailers for games in the way we have trailers now, for each game having its own trailer on YouTube that you can find and watch. A gameplay trailer and a story trailer, which most RPGs have.
Yeah, I love looking at indie trailers on Steam. It's like, am I interested in this game? I want to see the gameplay. I would like to see the gameplay, please. Could we? Which one of these is it? And they usually only get one.
And it's one of those things that I think you bring up indie games. You know, look at the trajectory of the Shantae series, right? A game that was on the Game Boy Color towards the end of its life cycle, back in when we didn't even really talk about indie games at that time. WayForward working a lot with Nintendo in the early days before branching out and working with other stuff. But if you look at that trajectory, it follows the kind of typical Nintendo formula in the fact that the first one's for the Game Boy, then the next one's for whether it was the DS, and like
it was DSi.
It was DSiWare, and then the next one was for the 3DS, and like just how these games like kind of evolved and how then they made their ways to now modern platforms, and the latest one is, as far as I'm concerned, a Switch title, like all of them are, but they are multi-platform. But
Yeah.
like Shantae is a game that evolved. Like the dances in the original game were actual inputs that you had to do to transform, which was a clever idea. And then in the next game, they made it so you could transform more easily. And then the next game, you lost all your powers and you had to use pirate stuff instead, which made it a Metroidvania, and arguably one of the best systems in the game that we will never see again because Shantae has her powers back. Like, it's one of those things that initial title, though, did so much to lay the groundwork. And I think that's what's important about successful initial entries is like the strength of that game, even if it's not perfect. Like, I got through all of the first Shantae game. It is a tough game. Thankfully, with save states and other stuff, it's not impossible to get through, but it is a challenging game. And I feel like the challenge back then was baked in because you wanted people to spend more time with games.
Yes.
Whereas the challenge now is like, how do we make this an engaging experience? And like, you think about Demon Souls, the first in the FromSoft now forever running Souls-like entries. That game was punishingly difficult, but had this incredibly immersive environment on the PS3 that no one had ever seen before. Not a ton of narrative, but a lot of environmental storytelling. And that alone sold that experience. And then they iterated for Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. And yet, even diehard fans in that community, which I am not quite there yet, have huge complaints between 1, 2, and 3, arguing that I think 2 is the weakest of them. I can't quite remember.
That is what I recall hearing from friends.
And so, like, whereas to me, who's only played 3 and a little bit of 1 and then Elden Ring and whatever, I'm like, I don't know. I think they're great. Like, they're for what they are. You know, it's just interesting. Or like you think about the early Armored Core games, which we're finally getting another one. Those games were for the tech heads, for the people who wanted to build a mech and pilot it. You know, like the combat is great and all that stuff, but the nitty gritty of those games were kitting out your mech.
Of course.
Not for everyone, but those games also continued to iterate and add more bonker stuff, cooler cinematics, whatever. I think I'm trying to think of games that really fail after their first entry. And I think most successful first entries will get a sequel. It's where when the sequel isn't as successful that then we start to see issues. But even still, I feel like you can find someone who loves every kind of game, right? Like we know folks who love the second Castlevania, love Link's Adventure, right?
And those are getting a lot of love and revisiting in the modern indie scene where we've even covered games that were like, you know, Infernax. What if Castlevania 2 and Zelda 2 were better?
Yeah.
They weren't bad games, but they weren't what people wanted at the time. And limited by technology or design philosophy. And we are also benefiting from hindsight on all of these. I mean, speaking of Castlevania, the original Castlevania is a beautiful encapsulated experience.
Yeah.
It is challenging, it is frustrating, but it is rewarding. It is never too crazy. You can beat it, you can finish it. It's only, I believe, 6 levels or however many, whatever the number is if you read the stages every time you open a door. And the bosses are built on basically Universal Studios monster movies. It's a little bit of a send up and a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek homage to horror, which is not what the series became. Right. Even though they kept the window dressing and made one of my favorite series of all time. But if the original Castlevania was all you had, it's a great game, and I think it would still be one people talked about.
Sure.
But we now have Castlevania 2, oh, it strayed a little bit. Castlevania 3, oh my God, this is incredible. And all of the iterations of Simon's Adventure that has happened, Symphony of the Night, and all of these ones that give context and shifting, because also you can use sequels to not only shave off certain gameplay aspects, but you can also change up and tighten up the story. If you have a singular entry, you can be as serious, as epic, or as completely ridiculous as you want. But if you franchise, you then have to temper that. Yeah. So you run into things like that. And then, you know, to go back to my Crash Bandicoot example, the first Crash Bandicoot had Tawny, Crash's girlfriend. They then got rid of her until they redesigned her for an alternate dimension storyline. And we got Coco, Crash's sister, who was a far more sustainable and enduring character. So you also have a bit of that. And it is very interesting to kind of look at games that come out now and go, are they designing for a sequel? What will stay? What will go? And I do know of a series that kind of fell off a little bit. Not bad, but fell off. And it's Katamari Damacy.
Sure.
The original is an absolutely fantastic encapsulated experience. If you want my full thoughts, I did a side quest on it. I love We Love Katamari, the sequel. It's a meditation on the nature of sequels and requests while also being a fantastic game that iterated and improved on the challenges therein. Can you name any of the games that came out after reliably?
No.
I can, but I love the series.
Right. Yeah, no, I can't. And the original creator only did the first two, right?
Yes, he only wanted to do one, and he found out that they were going to make the sequel anyway, so he went, fine. And that's why We Love Katamari is catering to your fans' demands.
Right.
And then after that, they just kind of, again, me and my Katamari, Touch My Katamari, Beautiful Katamari, Katamari Forever. I enjoy all of them. I've played them. I like them.
Yeah.
It was magic.
Yeah.
And it was always meant to be just magic and to move on. But they made more.
Well, I think also something worth highlighting when we're talking about initial entries in a franchise is I think sometimes franchises rush to do sequels. We're talking about Assassin's Creed, and the reason I fell off it was because I liked the first one and then loved the Ezio trilogy, and then played the third one and was like, I'm good. I've had enough of these yearly releases.
Right. Yeah.
And I've only checked in here and there since. But like then you look at like one of the most famous sequels that started as a small publisher and then ended up having to partner, like kind of come full circle to get the sequel out. They just released a documentary on the whole process. But Psychonauts 2, Psychonauts is one of those games that, and they go over this in the first episode of Psy Odyssey, which is the 32 episode documentary that I've started watching and is fantastic. We'll probably do an episode on it later down the line.
Once we've watched all 12 hours of this documentary, it is massive. I'm very excited, But
in the first episode, they go over the process of making the first game and how Tim Schafer famously worked for LucasArts. And when they were going to make a second Full Throttle without him, he was like, oh, yeah, I guess they own it. They can do that. I want to own my stuff. And that's what like spurred him to leave. And then Psychonauts, like the ups and downs, they partnered with Microsoft. Microsoft dropped them. They got picked up by Majesco. They continued on. They released the game. It was critically acclaimed and nobody played it. But then slowly over time, people started playing it and like getting access to it. It came to more platforms. And like that was a game that I didn't play at release. I wish I did. I would have absolutely bought that if I was that self-aware of like video game releases at the time.
I got it when the PS2 version came out. I didn't have an Xbox, but I was very excited to play it. A friend rented it, and I'm like, this is incredible.
I definitely rented it during the PS2 era, but I didn't own a copy till Steam many, many years later. And like, I wish I could go back in time and support that game because I love it. And what we ended up getting with Psychonauts 2 is not only one of the best sequels ever made, but one of the best understandings of what it's like to make a legacy sequel, the sequel after so long. To make it feel like you remember the game playing, a thing we've talked about a lot on the show, which is not easy to accomplish, especially when it comes to platformers. But like, I imagine the process was difficult. And of course, there's technically, it's the third game in the series because the Rhombus of Ruin, which is the VR 1 mission. But that's a path.
That's the Radical Dreamers to the Chrono Cross that is Psychonauts 2.
And like, but it's one of those things where you watch that trajectory and it's like, Tim Schafer is one of my favorite developers. I love almost every game he makes. They're not all great. Broken Age is a interesting game that I find myself often at odds with as much as I want to enjoy it. But, you know, I really have always loved their games, even the failed attempts, the Kinect stuff because they were partnered with Microsoft. But like the irony in which the way Psychonauts 2 got out the door was they were purchased by Microsoft. They are now owned by Microsoft when they originally had a deal with Microsoft that failed. It's just fascinating to me. And often I think it's important to remember when dealing with initial titles versus sequels, initial titles rarely have the same red tape that sequels do because you're carrying the baggage of what came before. Look, I'm sure Geoff and I would love a Shovel Knight 2. We got many campaigns. We got a prequel sequel, essentially, in Shovel Knight Dig. And I love all of the Shovel Knight iterations and games.
Yeah.
The puzzle game, I'm not good at puzzle games. There's nothing wrong with that game.
I love puzzle games.
So for me, that one was tougher to enjoy. But the thing about that is like, will we ever get a Shovel Knight 2? Who the hell knows, right? Like they're working on Mean of the Hollower now, which looks amazing. And I'm so glad they're making something else because I want more new indie franchises. But like the Messenger sequel is not The Messenger. It's Sea of Stars. It's a different genre. It's the same world, but it's technically a sequel time-wise as far as I understand. But it is not the same characters. It's different characters in the same world. Like I think that what indie games get to do that a lot of AAA studios don't get to do is really experiment because they don't have the same corporate oversight, right? Think about all the Call of Duty games that came out. I'm not a Call of Duty fan. Everyone knows that. I've played a few of the games. They're
Me
fine.
neither.
But from Activision, who poo-poo, they still suck. They do. I mean, I don't know what else to say at this point.
Yeah.
The management there sucks. The people, the developers, I'm sure, are lovely, but the management sucks.
The entity of Activision sucks.
Yes. But like, you have a hit with Call of Duty 1, 2, 3, and then you have Modern Warfare, which like blows the doors off of franchise gaming. You're going to keep iterating. But who goes back and plays that first Call of Duty, which I'm sure is a perfectly fine World War II shooter? I think it's World War II shooter.
I think so. I actually don't know. Is this like a Street Fighter 2 situation where there's still a thriving scene? I'm only being lightly facetious. Like maybe, probably not, but maybe.
But like, people would argue that those games lose their punch because of how frequently they're released. But also sometimes releasing sequels versus the initial game. Like the initial Doom and the initial GoldenEye, which we didn't really get sequels. We got like other James Bond
spiritual
games.
Successors.
Right. But those games changed how we viewed entire genres.
Yeah.
In a similar way that Final Fantasy did on the Nintendo. And then like Doom 2 and then Ultimate Doom, like all those games were coming out to just capitalize on the original. And I think what's interesting about indie games on the opposite end of that is like they are never trying to capitalize on the fervor and popularity of the original release because it works differently, right? Especially if you're a Kickstarted game, like you already have the backing. Now you just have to deliver. And as long as you're not a Mighty Number 9, you'll probably be okay.
Yeah, right.
And so it's funny to look at different generations of initial games. And like, again, I'm brought back to the NES. The first Mega Man game is fine, but the second Mega Man game is one of the all-time greatest Nintendo games.
There's a reason they got rid of a point total.
Yeah.
Little things like that. Or the first Sonic.
Right. How you could run sort of fast, but it was mostly a platformer. It wasn't until the second game where it was about speed.
Where you
Like,
could
it
have
was
the spin
truly-
dash.
Yeah.
And again, those little things where you're like, oh, right, there's only 6 emeralds.
Yeah.
The original Donkey Kong Country. Their entire concept of bonus stages, you weren't collecting things the way you were in all of the later titles, whether that's for good or for ill. At least they kind of organized it a little bit. And you then extend the grace of the design ideas of Mega Man 2 onto Mega Man because you could see where they were going with it. And you go, well, the gameplay's still great. It's still great to play as Donkey and Diddy, but I will, in a vacuum, always play 2 over 1 as far as Donkey Kong Country goes.
Sure. I mean, you also think about that Super Nintendo generation, like Mega Man X is an initial title for the Mega Man X series, but it is not an initial title for the Mega Man series. It is built off of what came before, right? The run and gunning, but now you have a dash. Now you can wall jump. Like, and I
But
think
you don't
that's-
start with the dash in the first one, unlike every sequel.
Right. And so like I think that's also really fascinating when new franchises are born out of games that came before too, which is a different kind of initial title, you know. And there's so many of them that have just kind of iterated. I mean, you mentioned the Donkey Kong Country games, and then we got Donkey Kong Country Returns, which is technically a first game in a new franchise. It is of course building off the lore of the previous Country games, but it is still the first in this new series by a different studio.
Yeah. And something you said before that I actually hadn't thought about was the fact that some studios do get the opportunity to, even if they're making a new character, a new game, a new whatever, they can either be very cute about making reference to their older titles or homaging it, bringing as much of it as they want, or outright making it part of the same world. The idea of The Messenger and Sea of Stars being in the same world but not reminds me of, you know, let's bring this full circle. Vagrant Story from the Squaresoft days of Square Enix, which was a Matsuno-developed title, who was the director behind Final Fantasy Tactics in the world of Ivalice. And Vagrant Story is like Final Fantasy XII, like Final Fantasy Tactics, in the world of Ivalice. But you're not going to run into any characters. There's just some references to previous tales through items you find, and it's allowed to be its own very cool, very experimental game, but also stand on that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's for good or for ill. Personally, I thought that was cool as hell.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the benefits that also a lot of initial titles have in modern gen is because games take so long to make, you get this breathing room. I think about God of War 2018, which I only finished very recently, and is one of the best games I've ever played. And like, I'm not a God of War fan. I didn't like the first game, and I haven't played any of the games since. But that game, that story is so good. God of War Ragnarok has not gotten the same universal praise. People will say that it is still a tight game. The story overall is still great, but it is not as good as the first one. And I think because these games are just so much bigger, there's so much more pressure to deliver. I think about we're getting, in theory, sometime this year, Spider-Man 2 for the PS5.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that.
And I loved the first one. Folks know that. We interviewed the incredible Yuri twice on this show. And technically, it's not the sequel. Technically, it's the third game in the franchise because the sequel was Miles Morales, which continues that story from a different perspective.
I mean, the argument about how you number sequels is
also a different thing,
is endless and far too big for us, but we'll try someday.
But think about the pressure of a second game. The first game has no pressure. Yes, that Spider-Man game for PS4 was in a lineage of Spider-Man games that were hit or miss, but it was the first of this new version, which is its own universe. It's not tying to any of the other comics and movies. And it was such a huge success. And I think there's something about reiterating. We're getting a brand new Wolverine game from the same studio. We don't know when yet, but we know we are. There's been so many Wolverine games, some great, some terrible. But this is going to be this is an initial release for this world, this Wolverine. But if you look at Wolverine as franchise, there's been so many games. The initial release was, I think, a Nintendo game.
I think so,
Nintendo Wolverine game. Or you think about Batman, right? There was a Nintendo Batman game that was barely a Batman game.
It was a fun game, not a Batman game.
But Arkham Asylum, however, is the first in that franchise and is arguably one of the best Metroidvanias and one of the best Batman games ever made.
And the sequels to it were very different in how much open world they gave it.
Right. And I think that when you're at a starting point, when you're not looking at what's ahead of you, I think that when developing sequels, you're always worried about what came before and what comes next, right? Because you assume you're going to get more because you're already getting more. And again, this is hypotheses. I'm not a video game developer. I'm not a video game publisher.
And any one of these things has probably happened in some way to some studio, just not all of them to all. It's yada.
And I have to assume that same pressure is there even if you're iterating. Think about Mina, which I believe still has a different lead developer from Shovel Knight, but still it's the same studio. And so you're putting out, this is not a sequel to Shovel Knight, but it is a sequel franchise. You're making a new franchise, a new game, and there's got to be pressure there too. And I think there must be something at least relieving about creating an initial game in a franchise that you don't know is a franchise yet. I'd be curious to talk to developers and ask what it's like to look back on that stuff, right?
I would love to do that, even just little sound bites and put something together. Because again, this is not unique to video games.
Right.
You have your whole life to make your first album, to write your first novel, to make your first movie. You have your whole life to make the first one. Then you got to follow up.
Yeah.
Sophomore slump is the concept. And that doesn't happen quite the same with video games necessarily because of the nature of the teams, the nature of publishers and everything else. But the emotional ideas of it, that's just human.
Yeah.
So absolutely.
Yeah, I think also depending on the generation, the cry for sequels were different. Again, it's development time, right? You think about how long it takes to make games now versus even 10 years ago. You think about the PlayStation era and how everything got a sequel. Medieval got a sequel. Most people don't remember that game. They remember the first one. You think about the Crash games. A lot of folks are more fond on the second one than the first one, and Spyro, all of that stuff.
There's a lot of fighting games that the first one's good. The second one's incredible. Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast is fucking superb.
It's one of the best fighting games ever made.
But Soul Calibur 2, and maybe it was because of the guest fighters or whatever else, but Soul Calibur 2. Street Fighter exists. It's good. Street Fighter 2 is incredible. Mortal Kombat. All right, Mortal Kombat 2 is a bigger deal, or more codified where Mortal Kombat was going to go.
Think about Marvel vs. Capcom 2, one of the most famous fighting games ever to exist.
Right, which there again, that goes back to the what is the sequel, what is the whatever. Is this the sixth game in the X-Men Children of the Atom series, or?
Right. Yeah, and I think it's just, there's no thesis or hypothesis to this. I think it's just fascinating to looking back at these initial releases so far removed, and then still having a wealth of initial releases in front of us. If the Octopath Traveler 2 game hadn't come out, that would be an initial release without a sequel until recently. Or I think about the Yakuza franchise. I will never probably play the initial release of Yakuza on PS2. If I can get my hands on it, I'd love to because I have a PS2. But
be fun to try.
For me, the initial release in that franchise timeline-wise, narratively, is 0. And like that's the first game I really played. But it is not the first game in that franchise. It's, I don't know, this 5th, 6th, whatever it was. 4th.
Yeah, right. I don't remember.
And so I think it's just interesting to look at how gaming has evolved over the years, how releasing sequels has evolved over the years, and where we were with these initial titles and how they made us feel versus the sequels. I think if it weren't for that initial release of Mass Effect, I wouldn't have had chills when the Normandy gets blown up in the opening minutes of the second game, right?
Yeah.
Like those experiences are defined by the games that came before. The reason Link to the Past was so inspiring to me was because I loved the first Zelda so much, even though I was bad at it, right? You think about Metroid, and like we're skipping games because for me, it's my sequel, it's my impact. Like going from Metroid to Super Metroid, because I didn't have Return of Samus growing up.
Right.
Like I was like, I have a map, I can control my jumps. Like
diagonal shooting?
It's just those things that like, I think like, I'm sure someone could pick up. Like, so as of when we're recording, they just announced that my favorite Metroid game, Fusion, is coming to the Game Boy Advance library on the Nintendo Switch Online on March 9th. Some people who played Dread and not played anything else, they're going to play that game in isolation without having the lead up from 1 to 2 to 3 to that game, like I did.
It is Metroid 4.
Right. I think they will enjoy it just as much, but it's why I push people to play the Yakuza games in order. They'll have impact if you just play them and pick them out of a hat. But there's something about going from 0 to 6 to Like a Dragon to even Ishin now that will add to the impact of those moments. And I think that's what initial titles do well, narratively or actual date-wise releases, is they add to the impact of the subsequent games if you become a fan of the franchise. In a way that if you're missing that detail, like you enjoyed the opening hours of Mass Effect 3,
yeah,
but you had 0 context. But if you had been playing that for the first time, knowing the story of the Reapers arriving and how no one's been listening to Shepard and now they're here on Earth, that impact is just so much bigger with that background.
It's clear in the narrative that that's what's going on, but I didn't have, you're right, all of that behind it. I mean, to speak to Yakuza, I, last night, as of recording this, finished Chapter 12 of Yakuza Like a Dragon, which is a very big storyline point in that game.
Yes.
And also contains, the game has had loving references to all of the previous Yakuza games strewn throughout. That one, they took the cap off the limit and just went nuts. And even my pop culture osmosis level knowledge of Yakuza recognized characters, or at least went, well, this is a big deal. And this is cool. Okay, cool. And I imagine, Matt, for you, did you finish Like a Dragon?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
I imagine for you, that was insane.
Yes. If we are talking about the boss fight, I think we're talking about.
The boss fight, definitely, as well as the music for it and other character appearances and certain things referred to. Yeah.
I mean, that moment when that happened, I messaged friend of the show, Rebecca Valentine, who I knew was ahead of me, and just like incomprehensible text about that chapter. And like that mattered so much to me because I started with 0. I started with that character and playing as that character because you play as him. And like we're tiptoeing around it because I don't want to spoil it, but if you haven't played Like a Dragon, maybe skip ahead a few minutes. But like fight, if all you do across Yakuza is fight Majima. And so to then encounter him in this game, the characters you're playing as having no context for who the hell this guy is, but you, the player, know exactly what's about to go down with him and Saejima.
And there's that light question of like, I've heard tale of the Mad Dog. Are you him? Yeah.
Also, that fight has the best music in any video game ever. I listen to that track constantly on Spotify, but like,
it's a banger.
I lost my mind when that happened. But I only reacted that way because I had played from 0 to that moment. You knew the impact of that moment, but you didn't react the same way I did because you don't have the legacy of it.
Right. He's still a cool character no matter when you meet him, and it was very fun to watch him in action.
Yes, but it's one of those things that I think what great initial titles do, the fact that you get to play as Majima and Kiryu in 0 and see both their stories begin only adds to the impact of that character every time you see him after, because you know, without giving up too much away, you know what Majima lost, you know why he is now the Mad Dog, you know what brought him there. And so every time he reacts a certain way, also throughout the Yakuza games, you get to play as Saejima, you get to play as these other characters who then come back into the fold. And I think that's something that I will always be grateful for in the world of franchises is the ability to go back to the beginning and play my way through. I think about how I just played Metroid Prime for the first time ever in the year 2023. And now if we even just get ports of the other two games, I get to experience this isolated 3D Metroid franchise for the first time with having played the first game first. If you want to hear a review of my thoughts, you could join our Patreon. But I think that what ultimately will be my favorite thing about looking back on initial titles when we have an established franchise versus initial titles that just kind of hang out in the universe is that legacy, is that growth, is that change? Is it good or bad? Is it exciting? Is it depressing? You know, you think about how the new Wolfenstein games have kind of gone downhill since they've come out. Things like that, right? Like, are you excited for sequels or are you sad about sequels because previous games have been letting you down? All of that stuff. You know, I will always buy the next Sonic game, no matter how good or bad it is. Like, for the first time ever with the newest Sonic game being as good as it was, even though it had its flaws, I'm so excited for a possible sequel to that.
Absolutely.
But like, the Sonic franchise has gone through hell and back. But I still stay excited because of the kind of way I interact with that franchise. And I think it's the strength of that initial time I played Sonic 1 and how much I loved that game. That's what strengthens my love of a franchise. And I think ultimately, to tie this all together, accidentally, but I'll roll with it, I think the strength of that initial game, and more importantly, regardless of its quality, your love of that initial title will only fuel your love for the franchise going forward.
Yeah, there's a lot of games that I will explore because of who's in it.
Yeah.
We've spoken before about the idea of I'll try a lot of genres if there's Pokemon in it. And that's not even like an emotional thing to it. It's a little bit of an emotional thing, but with the understanding of what it becomes beautiful shorthand of what it's meant to be or what you're trying to tell with this. And yeah, absolutely. Outside of the like phone game crossovers of we've brought in these characters, but if you iterate on a series, on a franchise, on a character, yeah, you grow to love them. You grow to follow them. I do sometimes wonder what the Legacy of Kain series would be like if they'd kept the Blood Omen original gameplay and just sort of built on that. I don't know. I'll never know. I'd kind of like to see it, though. But either way, I still love the characters, and I love their Shakespearean over-the-topness, and I am one of the many that are sad that they never got to properly finish the story.
Me too. Yeah, I loved Blood Omen 2. I played the shit out of that on PS2.
Oh, my God. Like, yeah, all of those games in their own way are absolutely incredible and absolutely abysmal games, and I love them for that. Each in their own way. It's great.
It is great. But we put it to you, listener. What are some of your favorite initial titles? Obviously, we listed a ton of ours, most of which were probably not surprising to regular listeners of the show. But what are yours? Are there initial games in a franchise that made you fall in love with it that you played way after the fact? Or that you've been with since the beginning, like I am with Sonic or Kirby? We'd love to hear your stories about that.
Yeah, what are the first titles from a series that you love that you loved the game, but you can't go back? And why? We are still moving forward on these things. We are always moving forward, and nostalgia is nice and all, but sometimes you can't go back home. Tell us about those as well. We want to hear about it, and there's so many ways for you to get in touch with us. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at funandgamespod. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Please let us know what you think of this episode, previous episodes, who you'd like to see on this show, or what you'd like us to talk about in future episodes. We love to hear from you in all different ways. You can also go to certainpov.com and find not only a permanent invite link to our Discord server where we continue these discussions, but also you can find a lot of fantastic Certain POV podcasts.
You can also find links to all of that cool stuff in our show notes. Now I've been including where you can review us on Apple Podcasts, a link to our Discord server, as well as all our social media. Also, what's there is our brand new Patreon. We launched it back in January. We have some incredible patrons already supporting us. We've put out some great bonus content, including a review of a Little Gator game. I did a review last month, as when this is releasing.
We sort of did a Nintendo Direct review bundle.
Yes, I did Metroid Prime Remastered, which everyone who listened to our retrospective knows I'd never played and played for the first time. And then Geoff reviewed Super Mario Brothers Advanced
4, Super Mario Brothers 3, a game which I've played many times in many different forms, and part of the review was discussing why we needed it. Or do we need it?
If you want to check that out, you can join at the $10 level, but we have other levels as well.
Absolutely. We want to keep creating more bonus content. We did 1 review 1 month, 2 reviews the next month. Who knows where this is going to go? This is sequels. This is iterating, people. But if you can, we welcome the support. You have our thanks. And we'd like to shout out the high score board today. Thank you so much to Case Aiken, Alex Lavelle, Daniel Nyden, Robert Proin, Rob Bacon Golem Tremarco, Film It Yourself, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much. Please enter your initials. There's a bit of a pressure-sensitive button to kind of get the different letters in there. We'll iron it out. We'll get it next time. Don't worry about it. We'll get it next time. Just do it this time. Thank you so much for your support. There'll be a next time because of you.
We appreciate all of you who support us, even those who can't join the Patreon, who write us a review, chat with us on Twitter or on Discord. We love interacting with our audience. We're only trying to continue to grow the show. I also find it is important for me to mention, because I believe this will be released right beforehand, but I will be at PAX East. Yes, that is right. I am returning. Geoff unfortunately has a prior obligation, so I will be rolling solo this time.
I am so sad I can't make it. I have been looking forward to this so much. Please, all of you have the fun. I'll have the fun.
But I am very excited to announce that I will have 2 panels again this year, because I am too busy and don't know how to stop being busy. And I wanted to give a shout out to those panels that I'm going to be doing on Friday, March 24th at 12 p.m. right in the afternoon at the Dragonfly Theater, and on twitch.tv/PAX3. I will be a part of the panel titled "The Nintendo GameCube was the greatest console ever made," which is actually, in fact, a true fact. It is being hosted and featuring a ton of really cool folks who have been on the show, done side quests, been on the show proper. It's being hosted by Jacob McCourt. I'm going to be joined by Cam Hawkins, Janet Garcia, Mike Towndrow, and Asa Green River. It's going to be incredible. Please don't miss it. And then the second panel I am doing is being hosted by Luke Lewis. It is the ultimate video game music showdown. We're all picking our favorite video game soundtrack and fighting to the death. And I will be battling against Cameron Hawkins, Celia Schilling, Alex Van Aken, and the aforementioned Jacob McCourt, hosted, like I said, by Luke Lewis. That's on Saturday, March 25th at 6 p.m., also in the Dragonfly Theater, and also streamed on twitch.tv/PAX3. Please come say hi. I will be there. I'll be walking the show floor. I'll be interviewing developers. If you see me, please don't be shy. Would love to chat with you.
Absolutely. We love chatting with everybody. We love all the ways that we can continue this conversation, whether on social media, through email, on Patreon. Thank you so much for the reviews you've sent in. Thank you, Eric Guess Who, for your recent very glowing review. Oh my God. It does help our visibility. It helps us get out there, and it helps more people be a part of this, because this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey, Nerf herders.
You sure you want to go with that?
Hey, everyone.
There we go. More inviting.
Have you ever had a movie that you really wanted to love, but something holds you back?
Or one that you did love in spite of a flaw?
Well, I'm Case Aiken.
And I'm Sam Alisea.
And on Another Path,
Sam,
we sit down with cool guests to look at movies that we find fascinating.
But flawed.
And we try to imagine what could have been done when they were made to give them that little push.
We're not experts. We just believe in criticism.
Constructive criticism.
Sure.
So come take another pass at some movies with us.
And every now and then, we can celebrate movies that did it on their own, too.
You can find us at certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Pass it on.
CPOV.
certainpov.com.